Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Rachel, because I do think that there's an important set of questions here about what are the implications from Harvard and UNC out to the rest of higher ed. You mentioned state universities. For context, Rachel's coming from the U of C system, even though she's going to A&M now. We also got a question in the chat about what will this decision mean for other aspects of university life. I know law review board admissions have been paused at certain institutions. But anyone who'd like to weigh in, what should we expect? Obviously, it won't be limited to the Harvards and UNCs of the world, but what are some of the other ripple effects of this decision coming out? And maybe they're going to play out differently than in the most selective colleges.
I think Rachel's point is is super important. As has been talked about in a number of other contexts, in the context of the sort of affirmative action, broader social debate, it is the case that for most colleges and universities in America, they don't even have to worry about questions like balancing or anything like this. They're just trying to get enough students to keep the doors open and keep the lights on and keep the faculty hired, and so they don't have to, it's not even an option for them. They don't have, they don't have enough candidates, and they don't really turn down as so many people. And so for most of those schools, the kind of admissions component of the affirmative action ruling probably isn't super salient. It's more relevant at selective schools. But that said, the affirmative action ruling is already having an effect on hiring in the private sector. For instance, there are already lawsuits that are underway appealing to the affirmative, to the recent SCOTUS ruling and its argumentation vis-a-vis diversity and its rationale and things like this, to argue that considerations of diversity, even in private sector hiring, are something that maybe need to be considered. That will certainly have downstream impacts, for instance, with respect to how faculty are hired and promoted, with respect to possibly other staff members as well. But I feel like one important change, and that would be a change that would be much more broad if there were pressure put on universities to change their hiring practices, especially as it relates to faculty. That is a kind of implication that would have much more broad impacts throughout the university system, not just at selective schools, because almost every university, as I understand it, even if they're not super selective in terms of admissions, do try to prioritize diversity in their hiring practices. And so I think that'll be an interesting thing to watch going forward.
I would add, within the field of higher education, I see several possible implications. One is that a lot of accrediting agencies include diversity criteria as part of that process. I believe those criteria will come under attack because the court said diversity is incoherent. We don't even know what it means. I think another area will be interesting to watch is the federal funding for minority serving institutions. There have already been statements that, for example, there should not be funding based on the proportion of Hispanic enrollments. HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions, are the most rapidly growing because the Latino population is rapidly growing. And the claim was you shouldn't have an enrollment threshold in order to trigger federal funding that's based on race or ethnicity. I think that will be attacked. And that money mainly flows to less selective institutions that serve large proportions of Latino students. I think also the court's decision gives some degree of cover for those who want to attack diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at colleges and universities, because it basically says diversity isn't a legible concept. And so those attacks are likely to have some additional legitimacy because of the court's decision. And finally, the court did say that there are some institutions like military academies where they may have an interest in race that's different because, for example, they need to consider race to advance national security. the court said it would be open to that possibility. Also, the court this term decided a case in which a woman didn't want to make wedding websites for gay couples, and they said that she could be exempted from a general non-discrimination standard because of her free speech rights. Well, that's very interesting, because you could say that composing the student body is an expressive act. And why then can you not be exempted based on your autonomy interests? I think the more interesting question is religious organizations, which have been given a lot of exemptions from discrimination laws based on their religious beliefs. Would they be able to make the claim that they should still be able to consider race? So I think those are all instances in which the schools are not necessarily the most highly selective institutions, but might still be affected.
So as I read the decision as a non-lawyer, I seem to perceive still some contemplation of the value of diversity. Obviously, the majority is always at pains to try to present the decision as very consistent with past precedent, even when that might feel like a stretch. But in the very fractured Bakke case, for example, the most famous opinion there talked about the value of other kinds of diversity. I'm going to try one more time to see if we can get some positive vision here about what universities should do. And I will actually call on you, Raina, because you've written about the Bakke case. Should that Justice Powell's imagining of, thinking of international travel and geographic origin and all kinds of other dimensions in the mix of diversity, is that still a live prospect? And should we go that way? Or does this decision just cut the heart out of that?
I don't think that this decision cuts the heart out of that. And I frequently write about Powell's opinion in Bakke because his vision of diversity, now, of course, in reading, sort of his papers and the notes he sent between his law clerks at the time, he viewed his opinion in Bakke as constituting a sort of middle ground between racial preferences in order to remedy adverse discrimination against African Americans in the US, and then also, this how to appease those who did not want any sort of racial preferences granted. So that's evident in sort of his papers. But his view of diversity being a multifaceted concept is quite poignant and important, and I think captures the pluralistic nature of the United States. It's unfortunate, however, because Bakke onward, simply because he said, race and ethnicity could be one factor among many in admissions decisions. That's what nearly all admissions officials clung onto in their understanding of diversity. And so for the last 45 years or so, we've understood diversity as being synonymous with race or ethnicity, when, and when Powell was describing diversity, he spoke about the student from Idaho, the farmer, he spoke about the pianist and the football player. And it is a really, interesting portrait of how he envisioned the United States being. And so I do think that there is still room for that. I mean, it seems as though Chief Justice Roberts tried to adhere to that. And both he and then also Justice Thomas in his concurrence kind of acknowledged that admissions officials have understood diversity in a very narrow focus. But that aside, I do think I think that this is sort of a wake-up call for admissions officials that, there are these other aspects that they ought to take into account. And I'm a bit hopeful that I think that they might begin to do so.